Chapter 16, Part 1 of Popular History of Ireland, Book 11, by Thomas D'Arcy McGee. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. The Insurrection of 1798, the Wexford Insurrection. The most formidable insurrection, indeed the only really formidable one, broke out in the county of Wexford, a county in which it was stated there were not 200 sworn United Irishmen, and which Lord Edward Fitzgerald had altogether omitted from his official list of counties organised in the month of February. In that brief interval, the government policy of provocation had the desired effect, though the explosion was of a nature to startle those who occasioned it. Wexford, geographically, is a peculiar county, and its people are a peculiar people. The county fills up the south-eastern corner of the island, with the sea south-east, the river Barrow to the west, and the woods and mountains of Carlow and Wicklow to the north. It is about 40 miles long by 24 broad, the surface undulating and rising into numerous groups of detached hills, 2 or more of which are generally visible from each conspicuous summit. Almost in the midst flows the river Slaney, springing from a lofty Wicklow peak, which sends down on its northern slope the better-known river Liffey. On the estuary of the Slaney, some 70 miles south of Dublin, stands the county town, the traveller journeying to which by the usual route then taken, passed in succession through Arklow, Gorey, Ferns, Enniscorthy, and other places of less consequence, though familiar enough in the fiery records of 1798. North-westward, the only road in those days from Carlow to Kilkenny crossed the Blackstairs at Scollagh Gap, entering the county at Newtonbarry, the ancient Bunclody. Westward, some 20 miles on the river Barrow, stands New Ross, often mentioned in this history, the road from which to the county town passes through Scullabog and Taghmon, the former at the foot of Carrickburn Rock, the latter at the base of what is rather hyperbolically called the Mountain of Forth. South and west of the town, towards the estuary of Waterford, lie the baronies of Forth and Bargy, a great part of the population of which, even within our own time, spoke the language Chaucer and Spenser wrote, and retained many of the characteristics of their Saxon, Flemish, and Cambrian ancestors. Through this singular district lay the road towards Duncannon Fort, on Waterford Harbour, with branches running off to Banlow, Ballyhack, and Dunbrody. We shall therefore speak of all the localities we may have occasion to mention as on or near one of the 4 main roads of the county, the Dublin, Carlow, Boss, and Waterford roads. The population of this territory was variously estimated in 1798 at 150, 180, and 200,000. They were, generally speaking, a comfortable and contented peasantry, for the Wexford landlords were seldom absentees, and the farmers held under them by long leases and reasonable rents. There were in the country few great lords, but there was little poverty and no pauperism. In such a soil the secret societies were almost certain to fail, and if it had not been for the diabolical experiments of Lord Kingsborough's North Cork militia, it is very probable that the orderly and thrifty population would have seen the eventful year we are describing pass over their homes without experiencing any of the terrible trials which accompanied it. But it was impossible for human nature to endure the provocations inflicted upon this patient and prosperous people. The pitch-cap and the triangle were resorted to on the slightest and most frivolous pretext. A sergeant of the North Cork militia, says Mr. Hay, the county historian, nicknamed Tom the Devil, was most ingenious in devising new modes of torture. Moistened gunpowder was frequently rubbed into the hair, cut loose and then set on fire. Some, while shearing for this purpose, had the tips of their ears snipped off, sometimes an entire ear, and often both ears were completely cut off, and many lost part of their noses during the preparation. But strange to tell, adds Mr. Hay, these atrocities were publicly practised without the least reserve, in open day, and no magistrate or officer ever interfered, but shamefully connived at this extraordinary mode of quieting the people. Some of the miserable sufferers on these shocking occasions, or some of their relations or friends, actuated by a principle of retaliation, if not of revenge, cut short the hair of several persons whom they either considered as enemies, or suspected of having pointed them out as objects for such desperate treatment. This was done with a view that those active citizens should fall in for a little experience of the like discipline, or to make the fashion of short hair so general that it might no longer be a mark of party distinction. This was the origin of the nickname Croppy, by which, during the remainder of the insurrection, it was customary to designate all who were suspected or proved to be hostile to the government. Among the magistracy of the county were several persons who, whatever might have been their conduct in ordinary times, now showed themselves utterly unfit to be entrusted with those large discretionary powers which Parliament had recently conferred upon all justices of the peace. One of these magistrates, surrounded by his troops, perambulated the county with an executioner, armed with all the equipments of his office; another carried away the lopped hands and fingers of his victims, with which he stirred his punch in the carousals that followed every expedition. At Carnew, midway between the Dublin and Carlow roads, on the second day of the insurrection, 28 prisoners were brought out to be shot as targets in the public ball alley; on the same day Enniscorthy witnessed its first execution for treason, and the neighbourhood of Ballykeen was harried by Mr. Jacob, one of the magistrates whose method of preserving the peace of the county has been just referred to. The majority of the bench, either weakly or willingly, sanctioned these atrocities; but some others, among them a few of the first men in the county, did not hesitate to resist and to condemn them. Among these were Mr. Beauchamp, Bagenal, Harvey of Bargy Castle, Mr. Fitzgerald of New Park, and Mr. John Henry Colclough of Tintern Abbey; but all these gentlemen were arrested on Saturday the 26th of May, the same day, or, more strictly speaking, the eve of the day on which the Wexford outbreak occurred. On the day succeeding these arrests, being Whitsunday, Father John Murphy, parish priest of Kilcormac, the son of a small farmer of the neighbourhood, educated in Spain, on coming to his little wayside chapel, found it laid in ashes. To his flock, as they surrounded him in the open air, he boldly preached that it would be much better for them to die in a fair field, than to await the tortures inflicted by such magistrates as Archibald Jacob, Hunter Gowan, and Hawtrey White. He declared his readiness to share their fate, whatever it might be, and in response, about 2000 of the country people gathered in a few hours upon Oulart Hill, situated about halfway between Enniscorthy and the sea, and 11 miles north of Wexford. Here they were attacked on the afternoon of the same day by the North Cork militia, Colonel Foote, the Shilmalier Yeoman cavalry, Colonel Lahunt, and the Wexford cavalry. The rebels, strong in their position, and more generally accustomed to the use of arms than persons in their condition in other parts of the country, made a brave and successful stand. Major Lambert, the Honourable Captain de Courcy, brother of Lord Kinsale, and some other officers fell before the longshore guns of the Shilmalier Fowlers, of the North Cork detachment; only the colonel, a sergeant, and 2 or 3 privates escaped. The cavalry, at the top of their speed, galloped back to the county town. The people were soon thoroughly aroused. Another popular priest of the diocese, Michael Murphy, on reaching Gorey, finding his chapel also rifled, and the altar desecrated, turned his horse's head and joined the insurgents, who had gathered on Kilthomas Hill, near Carnew. Signal fires burned that night on all the eminences of the county, which seemed as if they had been designed for so many watch-towers. Horns resounded, horsemen galloped far and near. On the morrow of Whitsunday all Wexford arose, animated with the passions and purposes of civil war. On the 28th, Ferns, Camolin, and Enniscorthy were taken by the insurgents; the latter, after an action of 4 hours, in which a captain, 2 lieutenants, and 80 of the local yeomanry fell. The survivors fled to Wexford, which was as rapidly as possible placed in a state of defence. The old walls and gates were still in good repair, and 300 North Cork, 200 Donegal, and 700 local militia ought to have formed a strong garrison within such ramparts, against a mere tumultuous peasantry. The yeomen, however, thought otherwise, and 2 or 3 of the imprisoned popular magistrates were sent to Enniscorthy to exhort and endeavour to disperse the insurgents. One of them only returned; the other, Mr. Fitzgerald, joined the rebels, who, continuing their march, were allowed to take possession of the county town without striking a blow. Mr. Bagenal Harvey, the magistrate still in prison, they insisted on making their commander-in-chief, a gentleman of considerable property, by no means destitute of courage, but in every other respect quite unequal to the task imposed upon him. After a trial of his generalship at the battle of Ross, he was transferred to the more pacific office of President of the Council, which continued to sit and direct operations from Wexford, with the co-operation of a subcommittee at Enniscorthy. Captain Matthew Keogh, a retired officer of the regular army, aged but active, was made governor of the town, in which a couple of hundred armed men were left as his guards. An attempt to relieve the place from Duncannon had utterly failed. General Fawcett, commanding that important fortress, set out on his march with this object on the 30th of May, his advanced guard of 70 Meathian yeomanry having in charge 3 howitzers, whose slower movements it was expected the main force would overtake long before reaching the neighbourhood of danger. At Tagman this force was joined by Captain Adams with his command, and thus reinforced they continued their march to Wexford. Within 3 miles of the town, the road wound round the base of the Three Rock Mountain. Evening fell as the Royalists approached this neighbourhood, where the victors of Ullart, Enniscorthy, and Wexford had just improvised a new camp. A sharp volley from the longshoremen's guns, and a furious onslaught of pikes threw the royal detachment into the utmost disorder. 3 officers of the Meathian cavalry, and nearly 100 men were placed hors de combat, the 3 howitzers, 11 gunners, and several prisoners taken, making the third considerable success of the insurgents within a week. Wexford county now became the theatre of operations on which all eyes were fixed. The populace gathered as if by instinct into 3 great encampments, on Vinegar Hill, above Enniscorthy, on Carrickburn on the road leading to Ross, and on the hill of Corrigrua, 7 miles from Gorey. The principal leaders of the first division were Fathers Kearns and Clinch, and Messrs. Fitzgerald, Doyle, and Redmond; of the second, Bagenal Harvey, and Father Philip Roche; of the last, Anthony Perry of Inch, Esmond Kean, and the 2 Fathers Murphy, Michael and John. The general plan of operations was that the 3rd Division should move by way of Arklow and Wicklow on the capital, the 2nd to open communication with Carlow, Kilkenny, and Kildare by Newtonbarry and Scollagh Gap, while the 1st was to attack New Ross, and endeavour to hasten the rising in Munster. On the 1st of June, the advance of the Northern Division marching upon Gorey, then occupied in force by General Loftus, were encountered 4 miles from the town, and driven back with the loss of about 100 killed and wounded. On the 4th of June, Loftus, at the instance of Colonel Walpole, aide-de-camp to the Lord Lieutenant, who had lately joined him with considerable reinforcements, resolved to beat up the rebel quarters at Corrigrua. It was to be a combined movement. Lord Ancram, posted with his militia and dragoons at the bridge of Scaramouche, where the poetic Banna joins the Slaney, was to prevent the arrival of succours from Vinegar Hill. Captain McManus, with a couple of companies of yeomanry, stationed at another exposed point from which intelligence could be obtained and excommunicated, while the General and Colonel Walpole marched to the attack by roads some distance apart, which ran into one within 2 miles of Corrigrua camp. The main body of the King's troops were committed to the lead of Walpole, who had also 2 6-pounders and a howitzer. After an hour and a half's march he found the country changed its character near the village of Clough, where the road, descending from the level arable land, dips suddenly into the narrow and winding pass of Toberneering. The sides of the pass were lined with a bushy shrubbery, and the roadway at the bottom embanked with ditch and dyke. On came the confident Walpole, never dreaming that these silent thickets were soon to re-echo the cries of the onslaught. The 4th Dragoon Guards, the Ancient Britons, under Sir Watkin Wynne, the Antrim Militia under Colonel Cope, had all entered the defile before the ambuscade was discovered. Then, at the first volley, Walpole fell, with several of those immediately about his person. Out from the shrubbery rushed the pikemen, clearing ditch and dyke at a bound. Dragoons and fencibles went down like the sward before the scythe of the mower. The 3 guns were captured, and turned on the flying survivors, their regimental flags taken, with all the other spoils pertaining to such a retreat. It was, in truth, an immense victory for a mob of peasants, marshalled by men who that day saw their first, or at most their second, action. Before 48 hours they were masters of Gorey, and talked of nothing less than the capture of Dublin within another week or fortnight. From Vinegar Hill the concerted movement was made against Newtonbarry, on the 2nd of June, the rebels advancing by both banks of the Slaney, under cover of a 6-pounder, the only gun they had with them. The detachment in command of the beautiful little town, half hidden in its leafy valley, was from 600 to 800 strong, with a troop of dragoons, and 2 battalion guns, under command of Colonel Lestrange. These, after a sharp fusillade on both sides, were driven out, but the assailants, instead of following up the blow, dispersed for plunder or refreshment, were attacked in turn, and compelled to retreat, with a reported loss of 400 killed. 3 days later, however, a still more important action, and a yet more disastrous repulse from the selfsame cause, took place at New Ross, on the Barrow. The garrison of Ross, on the morning of the 5th of June, when General Harvey appeared before it, consisted of 1,400 men, Dublin, Meath, Donegal, and Clare militia, Mid Lothian fencibles, and English artillery. General Johnson, a veteran soldier, was in command, and the place, strong in its well-preserved old walls, had not heard a shot fired in anger since the time of Cromwell. Harvey was reported to have with him 20,000 men, but if we allow for the exaggeration of numbers common to all such movements, we may perhaps deduct one half, and still leave him at the head of a formidable force, 10,000 men, with 3 field pieces. Mr. Furlong, a favourite officer, being sent forward to summon the town, was shot down by a sentinel, and the attack began. The main point of assault was the gate known as 3 Bullet Gate, and the hour, 5 o'clock of the lovely summer's morning. The obstinacy with which the town was contested may be judged from the fact that the fighting continued for nearly 10 hours, with the interruption of an hour or two at noon. This was the fatal interruption for the rebels. They had, at a heavy cost, driven out the Royalists, with the loss of a colonel, Lord Mountjoy, 3 captains, and above 200 men killed, but of their friends and comrades treble the number had fallen. Still the town, an object of the first importance, was theirs, when, worn out with heat, fatigue, and fasting since sunrise, they indulged themselves in the luxury of a deep and unmeasured carouse. The fugitive garrison, finding themselves unpursued, halted to breathe on the Kilkenny bank of the river, were rallied by the veteran Johnson, and led back again across the bridge, taking the surprised revellers completely unprepared. A cry was raised that this was a fresh force from Waterford. The disorganized multitude endeavoured to rally in turn, but before the leaders could collect their men, the town was once more in possession of the Bang's troops. The rebels in their turn, unpursued by their exhausted enemies, fell back upon their camping ground of the night before, at Corbett Hill and Slieve Kielter. At the latter, Father Philip Roche, dissatisfied with Harvey's management, established a separate command, which he transferred to a layman of his own name, Edward Roche, with whom he continued to act and advise during the remainder of this memorable month. End of Chapter 16, Part 1. Read by Sabella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.